So everything begins this way. A human life begins in the archetype of the mother, right? Any creative idea, likewise, begins in the archetype of the creative gestation, the origin point of the imagination. So any idea that you're going to bring to fruition, any image that you would like to see show up in your life begins in this Cancerian energy.
Greetings from the Pacific Northwest. You're listening to Symbolic Studies, episode 19. I'm your host, Mario, once again joined by my lovely wife, Michelle. Today we'll be discussing the symbolism of Cancer, my sun sign. If you're new to the show, we play voicemails from special guests and listeners like yourself. If you'd like to have access to early and exclusive content, please consider becoming a member on Patreon, YouTube, Substack, or elsewhere. Links can be found at symbolicstudies.com. But before we dive into these voicemails, Michelle, my lady, how are you?
I'm doing awesome and enjoying Cancer season so far. We've got some great weather. We just celebrated your birthday this week. And I also have Cancers within my family who are near and dear to me. So it's a sign that I really enjoy. But all those things said, it's a sign too that I'm always learning about because it's a mysterious sign to me as well. One of the beautiful things about Cancer and Capricorn, which is my sign, and we've learned this over the years, is that the opposite signs really bring a lot of complementary aspects to one another. So it's something that we've dove into a lot over the years, and it's really been helpful for us as a couple and as individuals.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'll say that this Cancer season really has brought to light even more connections between Cancer and Capricorn. And the solstices are incredibly important, and I'm sure we'll have an opportunity here to talk about that a bit. To kick things off here, we've got a voicemail from returning guest, Kristine Backes.
This is Kristine Backes, and I'm very excited to contribute to the Symbolic Studies podcast on the sign of Cancer. And hello and thank you to Mario and Michelle, and I hope we get to talk again soon. So the sign of Cancer in tropical astrology begins, 0 degrees Cancer begins at the June solstice, the Cancer solstice, when the sun reaches its northernmost point at the Tropic of Cancer. This is how tropical astrology is created and named and where the tropical zodiac comes from. And so you can think of Cancer as the cardinal direction of the north. This is the time where we're at the peak of the sun's light, not its heat so much because the earth hasn't absorbed it all yet. But this is the peak of the sun's light and the turning point for the sun when we begin to go from the greatest light and it wanes back to the greatest dark in the northern hemisphere. As the sun turns and starts moving back southward again in its directional movement along the horizon. So that gives us a little bit of a feel for Cancer, right? As a cardinal sign, it initiates, and again, from a tropical astrology point of view, it initiates the new season. It's also a water sign. Cancer is a water sign, so that lets us know that Cancer is a feeling sign. It has to do with emotions and intuition, and that's how we know things through Cancers. We know things through what we feel and what we intuit. As a water sign, it's connecting and it's also about cohesion. Water holds things together. You can think about taking a handful of dust and then dripping some water into it, and you immediately get something that sticks together. That's one of the activities, one of the actions of the principle of water. And again, that's a Cancer thing, right? It holds things together, pulls things together. In the polarities, Cancer is a feminine sign, which might be easier to think about in terms of a yin sign. It's receptive. It's also known as nocturnal. These signs are known as nocturnal. It's not about going off and carrying the sword. This is particularly, Cancer in particular is about holding down the fort, you could think about. That's more of a feminine quality, is that holding down the fort rather than running off and fighting the battles. And again, yin and yang are easier ways to think about it so we don't get caught up in some of the distortions of what feminine really means. Dane Rudhyar calls Cancer the matriarchal power of the night. Cancer, the great mother, has much to do with that quality of being a mother. Cancer rules the breasts, it rules the stomach, and the womb co-rules the womb. Also the containers in the body, and in fact, Cancer rules containers. And an example of a container in the body would be the pericardium, that container around the heart. So Cancer rules things that contain. And if we think about the basic principle, the essence of Cancer, one of the words I like for Cancer is containment. And not the shadow side of containment is restriction, right? Containment becoming control. But the conscious expression of that containment is creating a safe container, creating a place. It's creating a place where something can grow and develop, such as the womb, right? That's what the womb is, a place where the baby can grow and develop. Another principle of Cancer would be that of protection. And again, that goes to creating a safe space. And this is when you find Cancer prominent in somebody's chart, that sensitivity goes to creating a sense of safety, goes to creating protection, particularly at the emotional level, but it also obviously at the physical level as well. And that principle of containment and protection carries through to the home, right? The home is a place where, at least in theory, you're supposed to be able to feel safe. That's something that Cancer does, right? It creates a safe home. It also has that cohesion of pulling together a tribe or a community or a family. And of course, the shadow side of that becomes tribalism, where you are so tuned into the tribe or the family that everything else is seen as an enemy. That's the principle taken and distorted, and we see plenty of that in our culture, and here in the U.S. in particular. Well, maybe not just us, maybe everywhere, but it's something that we see out there. So Deborah Holding has described that moisture quality of Cancer as the creative condition which forms the basis of love, fertility, and reproduction. So again, those are all functions of Cancer. Cancer is more about personal sensitivity. This is the sign of the empath and the sensitive and the intuitive, but as opposed to Pisces, which is more feeling what's going on in the collective, the Cancer person is going to be feeling what's going on with whoever they're interacting with. It has that more personal connection to it. Cancer as a part of the Cancer-Capricorn axis. Cancer has to do with the past and tradition. Cancer and Capricorn together have to do with taking tradition and carrying it forward, taking what's good about the culture and carrying it forward. And again, the shadow side of that is holding on too tightly or being too rigid about clinging to the past. You can see with Cancer, the crab, right? That Cancer is the constellation is a crab, which actually rises sideways. It's the only constellation that rises sideways. With those pinchers, that's one of the shadow sides, is clinging or pinching or holding on too tightly. But you can also think of it as the provider in the conscious expression, the provider of values, provider of nourishment. So it's carrying those values forward. In a more esoteric way of thinking about Cancer, one of the things that would be interesting to do is go take a look up the Thema Mundi, the chart of the Thema Mundi, because this is a classical, ancient chart. This comes out of classical ancient astrology, and it shows the ascendant as Cancer. So it shows the birth, the beginning, the incarnation point as in the sign of Cancer. That's an interesting thing to go look at, because it also again shows you Cancer as that great mother, and even the great mother perhaps is the birth of the world. And in, again, more esoteric circles, the soul incarnates through each of the spheres of the planets, beginning with Saturn. You think about the soul coming from out there, right, formless into form. It begins with Saturn, but the final gate of incarnation is the moon, the ruler of Cancer, which again gets to Cancer as that gate of incarnation. And then just a couple of other things, because Cancer is ruled by the moon, we can pull some of our understanding of the sign from the moon itself. The moon also relating to family and mother. The moon showing us that sort of inconstant side of Cancer, the side of Cancer that can change its mind very quickly. And also, again, that watery nature of the moon and the watery nature of Cancer. You can think of it as the restless tides, is one way somebody described it. So those are all kind of the elements of Cancer. Those are the bits and pieces you can think about. I hope this has been useful and given you some new insights and some new ways of thinking about Cancer. Maybe I'll finish by saying there are no bad signs in the zodiac, and all of them have their conscious and unconscious expressions, which we've kind of touched on in this recording. And if you'd like to learn more about my approach to astrology and my approach to coaching, I also do coaching work. You can look up Kristine Backes. It's KristineBackes.com. Or if you are on Substack or listening to this on Substack, my publication is called Reclaim Your Natural Wisdom, because that's what I want to help you do. So thank you for listening.
All right, Kristine, thank you so much. That was an excellent voicemail. It's awesome to have you back. You guys might remember her from our Capricorn episode. And Kristine and I actually got together while bonding over Saturn symbolism. I appeared on her show. We talked about Saturn, and I think we're going to be doing it again here pretty soon. But she brought up some awesome insights. I like what she brought up regarding water holding things together. I believe she brought up dust or dirt and how water can clump things together. That's a fantastic insight, in my opinion, because of the containment dynamic that she was discussing. And related to that, so many people know that the crab has a shell and that this shell does relate to vessel symbolism. And so this puts it in line as well with Holy Grail symbolism, chalice symbolism. Of course, in the tarot, the cups correspond with the emotions and everything else. And I just think it's so interesting that Cancer begins with CAN, which is can. And what is a can? It contains something.
Right.
And so I think that that's just a curious coincidence, or perhaps not a coincidence, but it follows this Cancerian dynamic of the vessel and of carrying. And speaking of carrying, one of the things that really stuck out to me was the fact that she mentioned the Cancer-Capricorn axis as carrying tradition forward.
Yes.
That resonated with me quite a bit because she mentioned something about Cancer having an appreciation for tradition. And I have to say that that is kind of who I am in many ways. Mm-hmm. Most of what I read about today has a lot to do with what some people refer to as the primordial tradition, understanding that. And I know that you have a relationship with this as well. And I think this is actually one of the reasons why we get along so perfectly together, because I think we can look back and honor some of these traditions and see their value, essentially.
I agree. I was thinking the exact same thing, actually. Excellent voicemail, Kristine. It's always a joy to hear from you. And I, too, hope we get to talk again soon. I want to riff off this traditional thing because I think there's a lot to be said there. And I would agree with you with carrying forth these traditions. It's something that's really important to both of us to make sure that we are honoring that kind of stuff and paying attention to it. But also, to go into that, I think of what Kristine brought up about Cancer holding down the fort. I really love that. And that it's not about the sword energy that's going out to get something. Cancer is going to want to stay home, stay in its shell, and protect that area as it should. And with that, there's a lot of traditional practices that come with the home and keeping a home and what that looks like and why that has always been, and in my opinion, always will be, a very important part of what we're all here to do, is to take care of our homes, whether that be the home that's physical or even like the home that you have within yourself that we all will carry forever.
Well, related to that, there's no better way to understand someone's culture or tradition than by being in their home.
Oh, yes.
You can go to their church, you can go to their public rituals or services or what have you, but actually going to someone's home and seeing how they eat and how they treat each other, how they talk, everything is going to inform you about what they really value, right? So I think that corresponds with what you're saying there.
Indeed.
Hey everyone, if you've been enjoying the podcast and want to explore further, there's an entire archive of exclusive material available through membership at symbolicstudies.com. Over the past few years, I've built a growing library of symbolic lectures, bonus podcasts, and members-only content, including 19 full-length Symbolic Secrets episodes covering the major arcana from the Fool through the Moon card, with the remaining lectures still on the way. New material is continuously being added throughout the year, and members also get early access to every new podcast, including this one. If this sounds interesting to you, head on over to symbolicstudies.com and explore the archive. Membership is only $5 a month and directly supports the show. And with all of that said, back to our episode on the symbolism of Cancer. Another thing I wanted to bring up, of course, is this dynamic of Cancer relating to the summer solstice, which means that the sun is furthest north, and then it's going to start making its way back. And you know me, guys. I have a huge fondness for northern symbolism, polar symbolism, etc. And there is so much of that baked into Cancer. So when you consider, as an example, the Cancer glyph, it's the 6-9, which there's several interpretations for what this glyph is. Some people just will say that it's a 6-9. Some people will say that it's a sperm cell, 2 sperm cells circling around each other. Some will say it's a pair of spirals, right, going around each other. But at the end of the day, the way I see it is that it really relates to the spin of the heavens. It relates to the spin of the cosmos. And in that way, some people have suggested that it may reference Ursa Major and Minor going around the pole star. And this is intriguing to me because when we're talking about the spin of heaven, all of the stars revolve around a central star, which would be the North Star. And funny enough, I think you can make the claim, a very good claim, by the way, that the star on top of the charioteer's head, which is ruled by Cancer, especially in the Rider-Waite version of the card, he has the pole star right on top of his head. And so the pole star symbolically relates to the world axis. And when we're talking about spin, there's always that central point of pivot. And so that world axis would be the point of pivot. And then if we're talking about the chariot card, we're talking about wheel symbolism. And so it relates naturally and perfectly with the axle of a wheel. So in several ways, I think you can say that Cancer represents the top of the axis. And I think you can say that Capricorn represents the bottom of the axis. And this relates to the idea that Cancer is the gateway of man, and then Capricorn is the gateway of the gods. And so this is an older Babylonian understanding that we enter through Cancer and then we exit through Capricorn. You can basically imagine this as a symbolic pole or symbolic axis. And interestingly enough, back in the day, my understanding is that the solstices, it was actually imagined or viewed as a symbolic pole. So you're talking about the pole of the year, as are the equinoxes as well. So just a few things to mention there regarding the north and the sun's most northern position at the summer solstice.
I love that. And I love that Kristine brought up peak of the sun's light.
Yes.
And that it's not necessarily the peak of the heat of the summer because it hasn't been absorbed into the earth yet, which is very interesting. I'm going to use our garden as an example. because it is at its height right now. And it's not been until the last week or two that we've both noticed that. So we've been working up to this point of some of the plants being at their highest heights right before they go into flower. And walking through the gardens has been almost like walking through some sort of like prehistoric forest or something. Everything is really tall and it's just perfect, in its own way. And I just wanted to bring that to the table because that's where we're at in the growing season.
Everything really truly exploded.
Yes.
And so this is interesting as well because this whole idea, we were talking about this yesterday, the symbolism of explosion versus implosion.
Ah, right.
And when we're talking about the summer solstice, it's like the end of the expansive sort of phase. And then now the sun is going to be retreating. Mm-hmm. And so the sun retreats the same way the crab also retreats. The crab is known for going backwards. And so it'll retreat into the sand or into the rocks. Obviously, it's also known for going side to side. And so that's something that Kristine mentioned as well, right? That Cancer is the only sign that rises sideways. Very, very interesting. Cancerian people are very much like this as well. They can be evasive. They can be shy. They like to be homebodies, things of that sort. They're very introverted. And what's amazing to me is how this is echoed in a couple of the other creatures that correspond with Cancer. So when you consider the lobster, it's really intriguing that the lobster swims backwards. I had never noticed this until recently, but there are a number of older sky maps where they don't depict a crab, but they depict a lobster. And this is right in line with the crayfish or crawfish or crawdad as well. And you'll notice that also on the moon card, there is a lobster there, oftentimes in a body of water. It may as well be a crab. So the crab and lobster symbolically are nearly synonymous. And the lobster swims backwards. I had not noticed that until recently. I was watching videos of lobsters, and it kind of blew my mind because it perfectly fits with this retreating dynamic of Cancer. And the other thing I noticed recently is that the scarab beetle, which is the equivalent for Cancer in ancient Egypt, when it's rolling its dung ball, it's actually going backwards.
Wow.
So it's using its hind legs as sort of arms to push the dung ball, and then it's using its front legs to push itself. So when it's rolling the dung ball, it's actually going backwards. And so I just think this is amazing symbolism because of everything we know related to the sun retreating, relating to the crab retreating, and all of that stuff.
I actually do have a quote that goes along with this theme of moving backwards with Cancer. Mm-hmm. And this quote comes from Starlore. He writes, "The constellation was named Cancer because the crab is an animal that walks backward or obliquely. The sun, likewise arriving at this sign, begins his apparent retrograde motion and again descends obliquely." So there you have it, this oblique motion that the crab is emanating, which gives way to the actual name of the constellation.
Well, this is interesting because a lot of people want to know why we call the disease cancer. And how does this relate to the crab? One of the things you're going to come across is that apparently when people started studying cancer using more modern medical tools, they thought that these growths looked like crabs. And so they referred to it as cancer. But with this receding dynamic and this oblique movement, it makes me wonder if part of the symbolism is that cancer obviously is going to hold you back physically. And so it's going to impair your ability to live a normal life or to feel good and proceed as you would if you were healthy. And so it's just kind of interesting that it is related to this dynamic, potentially, this receding, backwards moving motion, and then what the disease actually does to you.
I'm so glad you went there with the actual disease, cancer, because there's something here which Kristine brought up, which is about containment. And we talked about that with the containment that cancer is. So it has the shell and the positive side of containment. On the subject of containment, what's happening in your body if you have a tumor, that's your body's way of trying to contain the disease or the diseased tissue or what have you. So it's actually a protection mechanism, which also goes back to the protective nature of cancer and the fact that the crab has that hard exterior shell, but it's very soft and sensitive inside of there. So you could look at cancer as obviously a negative thing. It's not something anyone wants to have to deal with. I would never wish that on anyone. But at the same time, we can look at this as an opportunity to resolve an issue that may have been causing the cancer, or there may be an emotional connection that we are being asked to look at, which is why the body is containing it for you, and perhaps it's becoming a large growth. That is your body wanting you to pay attention. There's a lot of things that you can't ignore when they're going on in your body, and cancer is definitely one of them.
Right. Yeah. Your body's trying to tell you something. You got to listen to your body. You're so right. And that is so interesting regarding the containing dynamic here. Maybe that's really what's going on with it, symbolically at least, with the name and what's going on in your body when people detect cancer. I like that a lot, actually.
I thought you would, and that's why I brought it up. The other thing to consider here is that in traditional medicine, we would look at something like cancer or a tumor as a means for your body to be telling you something. Your body wants you to be paying attention to whatever it is. And I would bet that there is a reason why this is popping up for whomever it might be that would be going through that. Whether that be an emotional reason or a physical reason, there is something that your body is setting alarms off for you to look at.
That's right. Your body is trying to tell you something from within, just to kind of echo this container sort of dynamic. In fact, with cancer symbolism, because of this container correspondence, when you really look at so many things in the world, we're talking about containers within containers within containers. And so we're basically talking about nested vessels, essentially. And cancer corresponds with this beautifully, I would say.
Hi, Mario. Hi, Michelle. This is Emily Ridout calling in from the International School of Astro Yoga to talk to you about Cancer energy. So Cancer in the zodiac is the cardinal energy of water. Now, cardinal signs initiate, they begin something directionally, and water represents the creative imagination. So when we look at Cancer energy, we're looking at the origin point of what will be birthed either by an individual or by the cosmos or by the collective from the initial point of imagining and gestating that manifestation. So everything begins this way. A human life begins in the archetype of the mother, right? Any creative idea, likewise, begins in the archetype of the creative gestation, the origin point of the imagination. So any idea that you're going to bring to fruition, any image that you would like to see show up in your life begins in this Cancerian energy. Now, Cancer is ruled by the moon, and the moon is the luminary which takes us from the initial beginnings phases of the moon to the fully manifest full moon, to the releasing phases, moving back to newness again. And when we look at Cancer energy, that's exactly what we're looking at. We're looking at an energy of birth and also of death, right? So the beginning of anything is the end to another. If you look at a human life, for example, beginning manifest life as a baby is the ending of unmanifest life without form, right? The beginning of motherhood for an adult woman, right, is the ending of maidenhood or not being a mother for that individual's progression. So when we're looking at Cancer energy, we're looking at the beginning phase of manifestation, but we're specifically looking at manifestation as it begins to move from the imagination into reality. So we're looking at the period of gestation, and this is very much why it is associated with the energy of the mother. The mother is the human who brings a new human body from not existing into full form. And as such, we see that Cancer rules a couple of things. One of those things is a field, right? A field of energy. The womb is one such field, and an antiquated word for womb is actually matrix. And for my friends who study the wonderful works in the Sanskrit literature, one of the words for the Sanskrit phoneme system is not alphabet, it is matrika malini, the garland of little mothers. And they say that the webs that the language forms, right, the webs of the mantric nature of reality are the matrices in which we live our lives. So we have this understanding with Cancer energy of mother, of matrix, of womb, and of field of expression. So we're talking about a limited field where we bring something into gestation, where we bring something into manifestation. Now, this is literally true in terms of creating a human body. And this is also quite literally true in terms of any time you create something. So an example of this is you are creating a podcast right now. In order for the podcast to come to fruition, you had to have an image, right? First, an image of what you wanted to do, and then a period of creation, a period of gestation, right? Working on that idea, working on that image, and then a manifestation period of bringing it into reality, bringing it into its fullest form. Now, a big part of this energy, okay, a big part of this energy is protection, right? Anytime you have a fetus in the womb, for example, you have to protect that part of the body. Likewise, anytime you have an idea that's meant to come into manifestation, you have to protect that idea while you gestate it, while you begin to grow it, while you begin to nurture it into reality. In the body, Cancer energy is rules, I should say, the ribs, the chest, the breasts, and the stomach. Now, yes, these are areas that nourish us, right? The breasts, our original form of nourishment, the stomach, the receiving end of the nourishment, but also the rib cage, right? The rib cage protects what is most essential. And here in the rib cage, we find some very interesting understanding of what exactly Cancer energy is nourishing, growing, and protecting. And inside of those ribs, we find the heart, right? The energy of the sun, right? The ribs, of course, they protect the lungs too, and so we can talk about that as well. But really, this heart is what is protected, what is sacred to the ribs. And so when we look at Cancer energy, we see that it's protecting the heart, which is ruled by the sign of Leo. And so we see in Cancer energy in the body very much reflected, the energy of the two luminaries, Leo ruled by the sun, and Cancer ruled by the moon. Cancer, the manifest, right? The gestating, the holding, the protecting form, and Leo, the form of the limitless light. And so we see here in the body itself, the relationship of the sun and the moon translating, right, the light of the sun through reflection into our realm. And then likewise, the moon in the body protecting the area so that what is attempting to manifest through the heart can come to full fruition. So that's in the body physically. There's also Cancerian energy in the forms of the endocrine glands and certain aspects of the brain. And maybe I'll bring up one of the main ones here is the pituitary body, right? The pituitary gland, which is very much lunar in nature, very much connected to the moon, and is in fact the gland that begins to translate to the body those images that we've created in the imagination, begins to translate that hormonally to produce shifts, very subtle shifts in the brain and blood chemistry so that we can manifest those shifts. Now, I think you could follow this to its ultimate conclusion, but maybe I'll just articulate it here, is that anything you're trying to create external to yourself, even if it seemingly doesn't have to do with your physical body, does come through your physical body as an embodied being. So there are things that are obvious that they come through the physical body. So let's say if you imagine yourself to grow into a great pianist, right? You're going to play the piano beautifully. You obviously have to train the body, the fingers, the ear in particular ways to transform yourself, to gestate yourself, to nurture yourself into becoming that pianist. Now, there are other things that seemingly are further from the body. So let's say you want to build a business, right? A business that's built on intellectual property or on, I don't know, stock trading or whatever people build businesses on, that has seemingly less to do with the body. And yet it does, because it operates through the mind, it operates through the plans. And so it all begins in this state. So what happens if someone is trying to build a business, let's say, is they first imagine the business, right? They come up with the idea, and it begins to gestate. And as they live in that vision, as they live in that realm of creative imagination, what happens is this pituitary body in the mind, right, starts to understand, starts to realign the structures in the body and the brain to be that sort of person who can succeed at that undertaking. And so the moon, quite literally, the Cancer energy quite literally, helps us to shift our bodies, shift our self-identification into a realm where we can be successful in the endeavors that we are undertaking. So I always like to bring that up with Cancerian energy. Often people think of like Capricorn because it is the more manifest of these energies. It's the more earthbound. But we have to think about where these things are birthed, where the manifestations begin in life, right? And then, of course, the person who has been gestating this image of the successful business that they'd like to create or whatever it may be, begins to live in the body of energy that is the person who takes the actions to create that business. That is the person who embodies the identity to create that business. You know, and someday maybe that business, they let it go and they move on to a new thing, or they keep growing it in different ways. But at each step in the journey, there's this process of imagining, of gestating it, and then the very subtle physiological changes that take place as the mind starts to view itself in a certain way, as the actions take form in a particular way. So when we're talking about Cancer energy, I always like to bring this up because so often people say, oh, it's emotional and caring. And it's like, yes, it is, but it's the emotions, it's the caring, it's the mental imagery that comes from that. It's the protection and the gestation that comes from that helps us align with what we're bringing forward. And I think Cancer energy is so interesting because ultimately it brings us to this idea of victory, which is one of the meanings of the Cancerian tarot card, right? The Chariot is the idea that we are bringing ourselves to victory. Side note on that, the Chariot also shows the Chariot as being a block of stone typically. The Chariot is very much the human body that's being acted upon by the higher consciousness shown in that card as the charioteer. I think I broke that down last year for you guys, so maybe I'll leave it at that because I'd like to say something different this time. But that is really the gist that I wanted to get at of Cancer energy, and I hope you guys have a beautiful Cancer season.
Emily Ridout, thank you so much for that voicemail. That was great. And I appreciate your perspective here. This is something that I feel like I don't hear that much about in regards to Cancer symbolism. And I just have to say that this idea of changing and having this mental imagery and this creative gestation and creative imagination phase before manifestation and sort of putting things together, accomplishing things, being successful, it makes so much sense with the moon. The moon is always evolving. The moon is always changing. And we actually get a lot of words. I've mentioned this before. We get a lot of words from the moon because it was a timekeeper for such a long time. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the measurements we have with time come from the moon. So as an example, a month, right? M-O-N, month. That goes back to the moon. Menstruation was a timekeeper / is a timekeeper. The M-E-N of menstruation goes back to the moon. And so a lot of words that are M, vowel N, have to do with measurement. And that measurement, I'm inclined to think, goes back to the moon. So man, M-A-N, or M-E-N, goes back to the moon. Minute, M-I-N, that goes back to the moon as well. I bring this up because the moon has to do with cycles. It has to do with time, as does the Chariot card as well. And so it basically has a lot to do with evolution. And so some people have made the case that we are all moon children because we're constantly evolving all the time. And so when you're born, obviously there's a period of time where you're just getting used to the world and you're growing, and then eventually you're going to start walking, and then you reach your adolescent years, and then you become an adult, and then you become middle-aged, and then you're going to get older, and your body's going to start slowing down. So no matter what phase you're at in life, there's always this constant sort of evolution. Mm-hmm. And we change as people, and we learn things, and we grow, and we have different trials and tribulations and lessons and all these types of things. And so you can make the case that this sort of constant evolution is very lunar in nature. And so we are moon children in that way. So I just really appreciate sort of how this is related to success and what she referred to as the Chariot card relating to victory. Absolutely. But that you need to have this creative gestation before you can actually accomplish these things. So you need to change. You have to hold space in order for you to change, in order to become successful, or in order for you to reach your full potential that way, right?
Right. And what this makes me think of is the Chariot card, and the charioteer who's on the Rider-Waite card, to me, has always come across as he's there post-victory. He's stationary. So it's almost like he went through whatever that battle was and he's parked. He's there, and he's almost like absorbing or taking in the victory that he just had.
Well, one way of looking at it, him being parked, actually has to do with the fact that he is stationary because in some ways, in order to be victorious, in order to accomplish your goals, that you need to be that unmoved mover at the center of the wheel. Mm-hmm. So you need to be unperturbed, even though there are many things coming your way. If you weren't stationary and you weren't motionless, you can be caught up in the storm around you.
Right.
So how many times are you working on a project and something happens that you didn't see coming? and it can really throw you off.
Oh, yeah.
The person who is going to succeed is the person who is able to weather that storm and figure it out and not let it frustrate them. And the more they can actually be sort of symbolically still and symbolically stationary, they're going to persevere through that trial. Now, if something happens that you didn't see coming and it sets you back and you really let it throw you off, it could potentially be the end of the project and you don't want to accomplish it anymore, or you start realizing that it's difficult and it's hard, so you just give up,
right,
essentially. So I see the charioteer as basically being another expression of the unmoved mover. So him being in the middle of the symbolic wheel causes the whole entire wheel to turn. That's another beautiful way the tarot gives you almost opposing symbolism, because you would think the charioteer should be moving. So as Emily said, he's oftentimes fused in cubic stone and he's actually stationary. Well, speaking of stillness, it's interesting that at both of the solstices, the sun is symbolically still for a brief moment before it starts descending or ascending. And I know you have something to say about that regarding the chariot, right?
Correct. Yeah. And I love this weave here. And I found this quote in Barbara Walker's Secrets of the Tarot. She writes, "Each year at Yuletide, when Frey was reborn during the 12 days of winter solstice, it was taboo for any person to allow chariot wheels to roll for any reason." I found that so interesting because here we are at what you're talking about, these two still points of the year. So we're at the winter solstice, and then opposite in Cancer, we're at the summer solstice, but we're talking about stillness in both of those times. And so to think about the charioteer being still and he's the unmoved mover, and the fact that it's taboo to roll a chariot wheel during these 12 days during Yuletide, to me says a lot and expresses this motionless movement and that things are happening when it appears that nothing is actually happening.
Right. And I think it makes a ton of sense that this would be at the winter solstice, because when I think of stillness and I think of nature being completely receded, I do think of winter.
Yeah.
You know? And so this is when people are going to be indoors. People are not outside generally. And it's just a very different time of year. And then the Saturnian symbolism with all of that, too, to me makes a lot of sense.
Oh, totally. And we know from what we've talked about and what we research and experience is that Capricorn is slow moving. It is heavier. It has the aspect of lead going on with it. It's earth. So that brings weight as well. So it's just really interesting to see how these two dynamics play off of each other.
Emily brought up the rib cage protecting the heart, which obviously makes a ton of sense. And then I love the fact that she brought up the heart correspondence with Leo, which is the next sign. And I just have to say, and this is kind of piggybacking off of what Kristine said regarding tradition, but tradition needs to be quote unquote protected. And so the idea behind having a tradition is that you're trying to preserve the tradition.
Right.
And so you're trying to protect the tradition. This is in contrast to a lot of modern ways of thinking where people always want to destroy in order to rebuild. When you're protecting something and you're preserving something, it just reminds me of that Cancerian sort of dynamic. And then, of course, Cancer has those pinchers, so it has built-in weapons. This reminds me a lot of Scorpio as well, which also has pinchers and is basically fit for battle. So this relates to the idea that things that are sacred occupy a sacred center or an inner sanctum, and that inner sanctum traditionally is protected. And so there's so many examples of this. I'll use one from mythology. One would be the dragon that protects hidden treasure, right? And so usually if there's hidden treasure in some sort of myth, there's some sort of obstacle that you have to defeat or to overcome in order to access that treasure. Symbolically, this is just like having an inner sanctum that wants privacy, that doesn't want to be basically public and allow just anybody to come in or experience that. So you need to have this veil. You need to have this container. You need to have this sort of divine protection, if you will. And so Cancer to me reminds me of that. So once again, just riffing off of what Kristine said, this idea that tradition relates to Cancer and Capricorn, I think you can make the case that cancer is sort of the protective barrier that allows tradition to be preserved.
Well, thank you, Emily, as always, for your lovely voicemail and all the things that it brings to the table. Speaking of the pinchers of the crab, it makes me think of tenacity. And this word came up and this concept came up in the Salts of Salvation. And I wanted to read a quick quote that illustrates this. "It is impossible to make a crab loosen its hold. Even though the leg may be torn from the body, its claw will not relax." There is tenacity for you.
Mm-hmm.
I find that very interesting because cancers and the cancer energy definitely has a stubborn side. And tenacity actually would be more of a positive way of looking at that. That, you know, yes, stubbornness can be stifling, but at the same time, having tenacity when you're doing something or when you're working on something can be very valuable. And you have to be able to sometimes stand your ground in times that you didn't think you would have to. And that tenacity really could come into play.
Oh, yeah. I mean, so many successful people are incredibly stubborn, and they have to have almost this sort of belief, this self-belief, to continue persevering through the lows, right? And so sometimes a business will take 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years to really finally reach its full potential. And it was because the owner or the creator decided to continue making music or continue opening its doors and continue advertising and everything else, right? And so on one hand, you can look at that as being very stubborn, or you can look at it as being very tenacious. The one thing I like about this too is that a lot of Cancerian people, once they hold on to something, once they like something, sometimes it's very hard for them to let go.
Ah, right.
And I think this can sort of echo in a multitude of ways: personal relationships, identity things and whatnot. The other thing I'll say about this as well is that Cancerians have a tendency, I've heard, to want to collect. This has been true in my life. I've had so many random collections over the years, and it just reminds me of the Cancerian person with their claw symbolically grabbing something and bringing it home and putting it on their shelf, right? And so because they're homebodies and they're more introverted, this would sort of make sense, that they like to go out and they like to find little treasures that they bring back home. And I think, again, this can relate to all sorts of different things, right? When they want something, they want it for themselves, and they have a hard time, I think, sometimes letting go of those types of things.
Switching gears, but staying within the same realm, memory comes to mind. Definitely with cancer and with what we're talking about here. And there are definite connections to memory and to the sign of cancer and to actually the cell salt that is related to cancer, which is calcium fluoride. And in the Salts of Salvation book, they say deficiency in calcium fluoride causes one to be forgetful.
Oh.
And how they talk about this deficiency with the calcium fluoride is that basically if you're deficient in this cell salt, your brain is being starved a little bit. So you're kind of like squeezing your brain dry a little bit. So it's not functioning at its highest capacity, which is why you may become forgetful. So everyone might know what it feels like to kind of have brain fog or, having a hard time remembering something during certain times of your life, not necessarily saying you're deficient in the cell salt, but it could be something to look into. And so what this brings me to is a plant that I wanted to bring into the fold today, which is ruled by the moon, and that is lemon balm. Lemon balm is famously known as a plant that can help you to improve your memory, can help you to have better recall. And what it does is it's kind of stimulating the senses. So it has this really great lemony scent that when the leaves are crushed and you can smell it, it is like a lemon drop candy almost. It tastes that way too, but it smells very lively and it kind of vivifies the mind. When it's taken internally in the form of a tincture or a tea, over time, it can really help to build the memory and just build more of a focused mind. It can really calm down somebody who has a hard time focusing, particularly children, adults as well.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, just to say, we've brought this up before, but memory begins with MEM, and that's a Hebrew letter, and it means water. And so, and even the letter M kind of looks like waves of water. You flip it upside down, you have the W, which also looks like waves of water. I'm inclined to think that literally we get the glyphs for W and M from water itself, which is why mom, there's two M's in there. Mama, it's such a common, nearly universal expression for mother. And so I just think that's interesting that memory has, for a long time, been associated with water. And also, people have said that water contains memories as well.
Right.
So that's a whole nother side of things, too.
Exactly. Totally. And the ruling element of lemon balm is water, which is another reason why it corresponds to Cancer. Now, I could go on with this plant because it's one that I hold dear, but I'll say that overall, it corresponds so well with Cancer because it really is helpful with the emotions and to really help people manage anxiety or overly emotional times. That's something that I've used it for. And so I just encourage people to look into it if it's something that resonates with you.
Absolutely. It's been here for us for a number of years. I know it's one of your favorites, and this is something we should get into in After Hours.
Yes, I agree.
Hi, Mario and Michelle. Before I jump into discussing Cancer symbolism, I'd like to first wish Mario a happy birthday for this Cancer season and many blessings for your solar return. As we examine this fourth sign of the zodiac, I would like to start off on the premise that when studying ancient iconography and mythology, we must understand that our primordial ancestors used these as mnemonic tools to store layers of knowledge such as geography, botany, biology, and astronomy. They were much more in tune with nature, closely observing the correspondences and patterns that emerged within the cycles and seasons. On this note, I'd like to look at three primary symbols of the sign of Cancer, namely the crab, the moon, and the chariot, and how all three intersect symbolically. So let's look at the crab, which we get the word Cancer from the Latin word for crab. And it's associated with the dimmest constellation in the sky that appears in the early summer months. But why the crab? Well, crabs generally breed in the warmer months. So for you guys in the northern hemisphere, their mating season usually commences in early July. And crabs as a fertility symbol for how prolifically they reproduce, laying hundreds of eggs, which is something they share with other animals that have also been assigned to this zodiac sign, like the turtle and scarab beetle in other cultures. In fact, scientific studies have also shown that the lunar cycles entrain the crustacean biological rhythms, such as mating, egg laying, hatching, and molting. In other words, they seem to synchronize these biological processes of reproduction and growth to the moon. For example, laying eggs with the new moon to capitalize on the higher tides to carry the eggs out to the ocean and out of sight of predators under the cover of darkness. Now, crabs, crayfish, and lobsters belong to the crustacean family. This means they have 10 legs, including the two large claws or chelipeds, which is Latin for claw feet. Perhaps our ancestors corresponded their 10 legs with the counting of 10 lunar months, which is the equivalent of 40 weeks, which might sound familiar to us as the human gestation period. This is why the number 40 can be found across myths, fairy tales, and even biblical stories, as 40 encodes transformation, just as we find the number 4 in geometry and mathematics, indicative of depth, volume, and three-dimensional space. For me, this aligns well with the Cancer's association to the mother, matter, matrix. However, I personally see Cancer as representing the threshold of conception and materialization. We find this in the square, and the only Platonic solid made up of square faces, the hexahedron or cube, which we find in the tarot chariot card. In last year's episode, I drew reference to the resemblance of the uterus to the outline of the crab and lobster's body, the claws likened to the fallopian tubes, and the crab or lobster's back or shell to the womb cervix. But I also see the claws resembling the C-shaped form of an embryo at 4 weeks old. The claw shape also reminds me of the lunar crescent, and we can perhaps even see this crab claw shape in the Cancer glyph, which many describe as either a 6 or a 9 rotating in a circular form, even comparing them to sperm. Women, like the crab, seem to be strongly influenced by the moon. If we consider menstruation an internal process only women experience monthly, which in turn seems to correspond to an external process observed in nature, like the moon. This perhaps began the oldest timekeeping, so it's no wonder that even today another word to say you are menstruating is to have your period. This shedding of the endometrium or the uterine lining is kind of similar to the crustacean's shedding or molting of the exoskeleton, don't you think? Now, I'd like to return to the crescent shape of the claw or the 4-week-old fetus in relation to the second symbol, the moon, in particular the lunar crescent shape. Now, the word crescent comes from the Latin word crescere, meaning to grow or to rise. And we find this in the Spanish verb crecer or in the French word croissant, which is also the name of the soft, buttery, C-shaped bread. Now, the croissant bread can actually be traced to Austria, where it is known as Kipferl. The root Kipfer coming from the old German word for the carriage stanchion, which are the vertical poles of a carriage or wagon. In German, it was also referred to as the wooden horns of a cart or a wagon, which I find kind of interesting that we get this word for a type of crescent-shaped bread. And then we have Cancer's correspondence in the tarot to the chariot card. But also this idea of bread can be traced back to ancient times of round cakes and crescent-shaped breads as offerings to the mother goddess. And it makes me think of an expression we still use today, a bun in the oven, which implies pregnancy. In fact, there is an ancient Chinese character or pictograph for the word bao, which we might know as the yummy steamed bao buns. But in the past, the pictograph for this word bao resembles a curved outer belly with an infant shape inside, and it literally meant fetus in the womb or pregnant. So this brings me back to the universal idea that the moon influences or causes menstruation. And we find that many indigenous cultures actually perceive the moon as a man or male deity. For example, the Maori of New Zealand refer to menstruation as moon sickness. And they have a saying that the moon is the permanent husband or true husband of all women, because women menstruate when the moon appears. This personification of the moon as male can be found across many cultures. We find it in Japan. The majority of Aboriginal tribes here in Australia perceive the moon as male. In Mesopotamia, we have the moon god Sin. In Hinduism, Chandra is a male deity. In the Norse, he is Mani, as well as we find it in the Inuit and Aztec myths, the male moon god. And this contradicts the classical conception of the lunar goddess as the moon as feminine force. But if we consider that the female principle is about eternal recurrence, the woman's vulva bleeds and heals. She's eternal, a continuing principle. But the male embodies the mystery of death. The phallus rises and falls. Whether we are talking towers, stock markets, or the sacrificial king, the male principle is about this limitation of death, the vanishing principle. The moon dies and is reborn. The woman bleeds but does not die. But when she does not bleed for 10 lunar months, she brings forth new life. We can start to see a parallel here between the dying and rising moon and the dying, rising male agricultural gods. In fact, last year I read this wonderful book by an American anthropologist, William Irwin Thompson, entitled The Time Falling Bodies Take to Light. In it, he put forward an interesting argument for why many primordial and indigenous cultures perceive the moon as a masculine force. Have you ever heard of the bull effect or the ram effect? Well, it's a biological phenomenon which is basically when you add a male or introduce a male like a bull or a ram to a paddock of females. The male acts as a stimuli for the female endocrine system, bringing a non-cycling female into heat or estrus sooner. Basically, the male presence induces or hastens ovulation in the female. Maybe we can even verify this theory with all the women right now swooning over the TV series Off Campus. Anyway, jokes aside. This makes a convincing argument, though, for the moon as a masculine force, acting as a stimuli to induce menstruation in women. In the same book by Thompson, he also draws together the symbolism of the unicorn to the Paleolithic bison horn. Now, he's referring to the bison horn to the famous Paleolithic cave carving known as the Venus of Lorsal, which is this voluptuous female form with pendulous breast, wide hips, and a noticeable tummy. And she's holding a crescent-shaped bison horn that is said to have 13 notches or incised marks, which some suggest was an early lunar calendar, marking the 13 lunar cycles in a solar year. Thompson suggests that the single horn, or the unicorn, is reminiscent of the Paleolithic bison horn. In other words, the pearly white unicorn is an avatar of the moon. In the medieval period, we find the famous tapestries about the myth of the Virgin and the unicorn. You know, it's said that only a pure maiden can capture the wild and fierce unicorn. On the subject of virgins, this brings me to briefly talk about the seventh card of the major arcana. To the ancient mathematicians like Pythagoras, the number 7 was referred to as the virgin number, because in a sense, it is untouched by other numbers. But the question I have is it actually a chariot in the chariot card? And the reason I ask this is because a chariot is defined as a small, two-wheeled, lightweight, open vehicle, often pulled by by two horses. That is, it is an uncovered carriage driven by a charioteer in a standing position. The lightweight design makes it agile for swift and tactical movement in battle or hunting. This is not what is often depicted in the modern tarot decks. Now, a carriage, on the other hand, is defined as a closed 2- or 4-wheel vehicle or wagon with an enclosed cabin with seating, and it's pulled by at least 2 or more horses. Now, in the modern tarot decks, it is a carriage, often covered with a starry canopy, with a seated man as a charioteer. But if we traced back to the oldest known tarot decks, namely the Visconti Sforza deck, it actually portrays a royally dressed woman sitting inside a carriage, pulled by 2 white horses. And if we looked at the Sola Busca deck, this card is labeled Dio Tauro, the divine bull, and it depicts a Galatian warrior king known as Dio Taurus, sitting in what I would describe as a very embryonic or crescent, even probably you could describe it as a seed pod-like shaped carriage. This makes me wonder, is it actually a charioteer if he's not standing but is seated? It makes me wonder if the carriage is actually alluding to the womb, the wagon or the carriage as avatars for the womb. And ironically, even to this day, when sadly a woman loses the fetus, we refer to it as a miscarriage. And the idea of a woman as a carriage or wagon pulled by horses actually reminded me of something I read by the French author Marie Cachet, in which she describes the mare, the female horse, as a metaphor for the mother. After all, the root of mare is M-A-R, mar, which we find in words like Marie, Maria, Mar, all in reference to words for the womb and the sea. And according to Marie Cachet, The fetus or the child sits on the saddle holding the reins. Now, the saddle is a metaphor for the placenta affixed to the mother's womb or to the mare, and the reins being the umbilical cord attached or held by the fetus. And this brings me to the animal whose breast milk is the closest to human breast milk. It's actually the horse. Who knew? In conclusion, because I'm running out of time now, the crab, the moon, and the carriage, or chariot in tarot, intersect with the themes of fertility, reproduction, and the overall conception and gestation of life. Some may even say that it is the birth of life that is the axis mundi, for without new life, the world would cease to exist. Thank you again, guys, for giving me this opportunity to share some of my musings on the sign of Cancer. And if anyone wants to find me, they can search on Substack, The Venus Diaries. Thanks again, guys.
All right, Katriena, thank you so much for that voicemail. You're always giving us so much stuff to contemplate and chew on. And so this voicemail was no different. Of course, one of the first things I want to bring up is this idea of the moon being not feminine necessarily, but more masculine in nature. You brought up some excellent points there. And admittedly, when I make videos and I talk about the moon or lunar symbolism publicly, I generally lean on the feminine. But you really have to make space for this other consideration here. Mm-hmm. And so as you brought up, the whole idea of the moon inducing menstruation, I think is really fascinating. And then, of course, we could have a whole conversation as well, and perhaps we should next month, with the sun actually being more feminine, not necessarily masculine, or at the very least acknowledging the cultures that saw it as feminine and not masculine. Another example of this dynamic would be Thoth in the Egyptian pantheon being a lunar deity as well. And that would be the equivalent of Mercury or Hermes in more modern contexts. And actually, our good friend Ben Balderson, who was on the Gemini episode, he's right there with you regarding this correspondence of the moon being masculine, the sun being feminine. And he has all of his reasons for that. You brought up the crescent and the crescent moon. And I just have to mention, I think it's so interesting that the letter C looks like a crescent. Mm-hmm. In fact, I'm kind of inclined to think that we get the shape of the letter C from the crescent moon. And isn't it interesting that when we're talking about lunar symbolism, there is this relationship with the ocean, and we also refer to the ocean as a sea, the 7 seas. And so I just think it's kind of curious that Crescent begins with C, Cancer begins with C, Chariot begins with C, and then just phonetically, the letter C also sounds like S-E-A. So that's just something to consider there. And of course, once again, we're talking about the moon's influence on both men and women, but of course, the relationship with menstruation and this molting or shedding sort of dynamic. Very, very interesting. Mm-hmm. And related to that, there is this idea that the moon has this ability to turn people into things that are perhaps undesirable, perhaps not balanced, not aligned, things of that sort. So we have words like lunacy, mm-hmm. which comes from lunar. And then we even have words like monster, M-O-N, that actually have a relationship back to the moon. So think of the werewolf as an example. The werewolf changes underneath a full moon. So monster and the moon definitely have a relationship with each other. And one thing people have said is that this association of the moon making you crazy, which actually kind of has a long arc. People have had various superstitions over time that you shouldn't leave your window open during a full moon. You shouldn't let moonlight touch your face or touch your eyes as you're sleeping. There's all sorts of different folk tales about this and lore about this. And what some people have said is that this only came about after people became more patriarchal, and that as we've become more solar over time, the moon has kind of been relegated to being this crazy driving planet or something along these lines. So just something to consider, that this idea that the moon makes you crazy, turns you into a monster or a lunatic, is potentially a modern corruption of lunar symbolism.
Yes, and I have something that will bring some more clarity to this, which comes from an herbalist who I've spoke about before on the show, but her name is Susan Weed. She has a wonderful book on menopause, and I highly recommend it for all women. And in the book, she talks about how you can naturally balance your hormones by sleeping in the moonlight or allowing the moonlight to be shown down on you when it's a full moon, when the moon is increasing. And with this in mind, she also talks about how important it is to sleep in complete darkness. So she recommends that when it's not a full moon, to be sleeping with an eye pillow or covering your eyes. So you are in complete darkness. And the only time that you wouldn't sleep like that is when the moon is full.
Oh.
So this goes to your point of this lunacy thing connected to the moon started happening when the patriarchal societies became more prevalent. And so with that said, perhaps the moon isn't making you crazy. It's actually bringing more balance to something important like your hormones.
Very interesting how many different takes there are about this, because I know some other people who have done research and have basically suggested that the moon's light, which is a whole conversation as well, that the moon's light is more septic in nature.
Right.
So it causes things to decay. It causes things to break down. So is that the truth or is it not? It's very, very intriguing, how many different angles there are with all of this. Related to this, I just have to say as well, next time there's a full moon, go outside and notice the quality of light with the full moon and notice how you feel. Notice if you feel cooler in the moon's light or if you feel something else. And then step into the shadow of the moon. So go behind a building, go behind a tree, go into the shadow and notice if you feel a difference. We've both done it a number of times. The moon's light is cooler. And then you step into the shadow and it's actually warmer in the shadow. So when you're exposed just to the light itself, you feel this coolness. And so this is partly what people have said for a long time too, that the quality of light is actually different. Obviously, this doesn't sound logical. It doesn't sound like this would be the case, but try it for yourself and then tell me what you think. I've had a number of people do this, students and whatnot, and they all have come back and said the exact same thing. It is actually cooler. So make of that what you will, but I just had to throw that out there.
And as usual, we're going back and forth and opening up the possibilities for multiple ways of looking at the situation with the moon. Does it cause lunacy? Does it cause balance? Cooler, warmer, what have you? There's a quote here from the Zodiac and the Salts of Salvation that talks about this here. And they say, "It is well known that the brain disease termed lunacy becomes intensified during certain periods of the moon. And as Luna is the ancient name of the moon, we now have the key to this symptom. The brain fluid or ocean of the Great Mother is disturbed." I really like how they say that, regardless if the moon is causing lunacy or not. I like the idea of the ocean of the Great Mother and it being disturbed. So when there's water being splashed or moved or vibrated, there's a disturbance being caused. So you're not able to see as clearly through that water, which then causes distortions and it causes the water to hold the memory of that movement or that vibration, what have you. So there's something to be said about this influence, regardless of what's really going on.
The moon is so mysterious. That's one of the things that is worth just kind of saying explicitly, is that as close of a relationship as we have with the moon, because we can see the texture of the moon with our naked eye, we can see its craters, all these things, there's still so much that I feel like we don't know about it.
Oh, yeah.
And there are so many anomalies as well. In fact, I have a book called Who Built the Moon, and it goes through all of these anomalies with the moon. From the fact that we cannot see the dark side of the moon, to the fact that during eclipses, it's the exact same size as the sun. So I'm of the opinion that there is still more to be unveiled, actually, about the moon. And in fact, I've kind of come to the point where I'm just embracing the mystery of the moon versus pretending to know everything about it, right?
Yeah, that's more of a healthy way to go.
3 goddesses for Cancer, each one embodying a different dimension of the sign, like phases of the moon: Selene, Artemis, and Hera. Selene is the physical moon itself. She is associated with horses, she's associated with oxen, and obviously each of these animals carries individual lunar significance. Oxen with their large crescent horns, horses long associated with the sea, with the tides, ruled or governed or influenced by the moon. The most famous myth of Selene is her seduction of the shepherd prince Endymion, with whom she enchants into an eternal sleep. She grants him eternal beauty through the agency of Zeus, and she has 50 daughters by him. Selene is a very powerful image, albeit very subtle, of the tremendous romanticism inherent within Cancer, of which we don't readily discuss as a property of the sign, as well as the dreaminess of Cancer, since the courtship transpires primarily through his sleep. Because Endymion is kept eternally young while she herself is a goddess, it's also suggestive of a mother caring for an infant. So we have the otherworldly, fantastical element of Cancer, the gentleness of Cancer, the romanticism, and the nurturing dimension, this soft blurring between the maternity and the erotic. So that is a poetic image. And then poetry is something close to Cancer's heart. Artistry as a whole, incidentally, another facet of the sign that's not properly qualified. We have a number of artists in the wheel, but Cancer is among the premier, gifted in poetry, photography, music, theater, and film, especially film. When we watch movies, we sit in a dark theater and experience moving images. It's like being in the womb. Next, we have Artemis, lady of the wild beasts, goddess of the wild savagery of nature, the primal ferocity of the instincts. Artemis is fascinating because of her dichotomy, and that she is at once also a nurturing goddess like Selene, and also a sister to a solar deity like Selene. But Artemis was born first. The first child of the Titan is Leto, likewise associated with maternity and children herself, persecuted by the goddess Hera for her adulterous relationship with Zeus, the divine twin's father. Artemis, as a divine infant toddler, acts as midwife for the birth of her brother Apollo. So she facilitates birth. She is so closely aligned with her mother Leto, and a protector of young animals. Yet at the same token, Artemis is also goddess of the hunt, of the chase. So she is a goddess that helps bring life into fruition, but she is also a goddess that enacts its destruction, and she enacts its death. Nature is a cruel cycle. We see this reflected in the predatory nature of lions, of bears, of boars, and wolves. These are all animals associated with Artemis exclusively. Her famous virginity represents the inviolable, impenetrable dimension of raw nature itself, that she does not favor cities. She is not a goddess of worlds men construct, unlike civilized Athene, a self-proclaimed champion of heroes, of men. Artemis is not a goddess of civility, of civilization. The civilization that she represents, the world that she embodies, is untamed, untouched, in the darkness of the forest, in the darkness of the field, in the darkness of night, where men do not have prominence and humanity has no power, where only the animals survive, hunting and hunted. And she is, of course, a patron of Amazons, the famous warrior women. All this exists in the deepest core of Cancer, this tug at the mysterious nocturnal wild. We can also mention here the famous myth of Artemis where she bathes naked. That's another dimension of her virginity, the private sanctity of nature. And when the hunter Actaeon spies upon her, it's not just that he stumbles upon her, but he sees her and enacts a hubris by not looking away. It's the fact that he continued to gaze, that he continued to attempt to penetrate, that he continued to attempt to invade upon this sacred space that is not meant for the human, certainly not men. That is why Artemis enacts her revenge by turning him into a stag and having him eaten alive. When Orion boasts that he can master any animal in the forest, Artemis sends a scorpion to sting him to death. Artemis, like Cancer, is an enemy of the masculine. Lastly, we can mention Hera, who in myth sends a gigantic crustacean, the crab, to come and impinge at Heracles' feet while he fights the Hydra. Heracles, incidentally, means the glory of Hera. Heracles and perhaps Achilles, incidentally, they are Cancerian heroes in myth, known for their tremendous emotionality and worldly prominence through their engagement with mother goddesses, one biological and another through marriage, but both divine. Heracles, whom we can revisit in Leo since he famously wears a lion skin, has a powerful relationship with Hera. Nearly all of his narratives involve his struggle against her, even since his birth when she accidentally nurses him. Not all Cancers universally adore their mothers. The important reality is her prominence in their lives. With Hera, we can also mention the fact that, so not only is she the source of the sign, the crab itself, Hera also creates her children parthenogenically. She's not a goddess of motherliness like Demeter, whom we could mention, but the power that comes from being a mother. She is unique amongst her Olympian peers, but that she is a goddess of motherhood, for she is said to make children on her own. And that recalls Gaia, who also is said to parthenogenically produce children. Her sons are meant to cement her power. Her marriage to Zeus is the foundation of the family, which becomes the core of the tribe, and the tribe leads to nations, all secured through the power and agency of women. When Zeus does not fulfill his marital responsibilities, she will take the initiative herself to cement her authority. Hera will curse his bastard children with madness, with transformations into animals similar to Circe. These are all threats to her family line and must be eradicated. These different dimensions of Cancer are very, very rich, and we can see the power and the assertive leadership of the family and of domestic and matriarchal matrimony within Hera. We can see the raw emotionality and the wildness of the instincts in Artemis, and we could return to the beginning, the slumberous romanticism of Cancer within Selene. Thank you very much for this opportunity. My Instagram handle is tmackey1018, or you can find me at CoreTomMac69. I'm always pleased and delighted and honored to be included with these, and I look forward to participating in the future.
All right, Tom, thank you so much for calling in and giving us that breakdown. Awesome stuff, as usual. So much to talk about here. One of the things, though, that really resonated with all the stuff you brought up with Artemis. Mm-hmm. And, you know, the first thing I think of is Artemis and her bow, and how the bow looks kind of like a crescent moon. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot of symbolism there that you can basically overlap with that. And the way I tend to look at it is that the bow and arrow really is a perfect sort of complement between feminine and masculine. And when I think of masculine symbolism, yang symbolism, I think of the phallus, and I think of this driving nature, right? This penetrative nature with basically all weapons, but especially with ammo, right? So bullets, I think of the arrow itself, right? To me, this reminds me actually of sexual symbolism with the sperm cells and how the sperm swim and how they drive forward and penetrate that egg, right? And so it's the sperm of man that leaves the phallus to inseminate the egg. And with so much feminine symbolism, there is this receptivity. So I think of a queen on her throne, how she receives abundance. I've said this before, but women are so magnetic. Opportunities come to them. Men more so have to go out and create their own opportunities, etc. And so when you relate this to the bow and arrow, it's the masculine arrow that leaves, but it's the feminine bow that stays with the huntress in this case. And so the symbolism between bow and the moon or the feminine, to me, is just really, really beautiful.
Thank you, Tom, as always. Lovely stuff. And I, too, have a lot of thoughts with Artemis because she is the goddess of the hunt. And what comes to mind when I think of her in general is protection. So that goes back to the theme that we've been talking about throughout the podcast with protection and Cancer and how important this is. And one of the things I always remember about Artemis is that she is the protector of her own chastity, but the chastity of all women. That's one of the things that she is known for, as well as being the protector of woodland creatures. So she's kind of like a forest goddess. So she's hunting things, but she's also protecting the woodland creatures. Kind of an interesting dynamic. One of the things that also always comes to mind with Artemis is mugwort, which is an herb that is widely known as being connected to the moon. It's also connected to Venus, but I digress and we'll just focus on the moon aspects for now. Artemisia vulgaris is the Latin name for one of the most common types of mugwort, and you will often see that associated with Artemis. You'll also see it associated with the crone. So again, we're going back to this wise woman protective, motherly. She's lived it. She's seen it. She knows it. She will be able to bestow wisdom upon you that will protect you moving forward. If you are to take her wise words to heart, you can use that to go forward and use it as a force of protection.
And I just have to say, the mugwort around here is smelling amazing.
Whew, it's so beautiful. And I got to say that there are multiple types of mugwort. And so the mugwort Mario is referring to is Artemisia douglasiana, which is always usually used for its wonderful scent. So a lot of times you'll see mugwort bundled as a smudge, and most of the time it is that type of Artemisia that is used because the scent is just, it's intoxicating. I've told Mario this so many times, but it is my all-time favorite scent in the entire world. And if you ever come across it and are able to smell it, you'll know why.
Absolutely. You've made me a mugwort fan over the years because it is one of your favorites and you talk about it all the time. But mugwort, all varieties have a silver sort of dynamic underneath the leaf, right?
Yes, you're right. And actually that silvery underleaf color is one of the best ways to identify mugwort. And it has sort of like this soft, downy texture. So soft to the touch, almost feels like a very soft fabric.
Right. And so if it hasn't been said this episode, silver corresponds with the moon. And it's interesting that silver for such a long time was the main metal, the main precious metal for exchange and for commerce and things like that. And it's interesting that we have money. Some people have made the claim that it's actually moon eye, essentially. And so there is potentially a relationship there. I can really get into this. I'll talk about it briefly. But with money symbolism, there's a lot of watery connotations. So as an example, we call it currency, like a current, right? We put money into a bank, like the bank of a river. And there's just a number of examples, fluidity, has a relationship with money and, of course, with the moon. And so you can really go on and on and on with that. I think it's interesting that there's a lot of money symbolism with Hermes and Mercury as well. And once again, Hermes and Mercury, or especially Thoth, really, in ancient Egypt, he was a moon deity. He was a moon god. But both Hermes and Mercury have a lot of lunar symbolism attached to them as well, which I think kind of gets overlooked, in some ways. In fact, the moon and Mercury, the planet, there's a lot of interesting overlapping themes with that too. I did a whole presentation on it. If people really want to learn about this dynamic, check out my moon card episode for Symbolic Secrets. Hey guys, it's Mario once again. I just wanted to let you know that Michelle and I are now recording companion episodes for all podcasts. So if you're looking for even more insights on cancer, keep an eye out for our After Hours release, where we continue the conversation and cover everything else we weren't able to get to in the main episode. In this episode, we talk about cancer as the least popular sign of the zodiac, lunar mysteries, moonchild rituals, Cancerian plants, and much, much more. After Hours is for members only, and of course, we hope you consider joining. Become a member and get all the exclusives at symbolicstudies.com. Okay, back to the show. But speaking of silver, Tom also mentioned cinema. He mentioned film. And we have the silver screen, right, which the images are projected onto. And people may not know this, but these screens actually have a light metallic reflective material on them so that the image actually pops while being projected on that screen. So again, hence the silver screen. And he's so right. Cancer symbolism relates to art. There's a lot of artists that are cancers, myself included. And I think that it has to do with some of what Emily mentioned or discussed about this creative gestation related to imagination and all these different types of things. And I like what Tom said regarding the fact that when you are watching a movie, it's as though you're in the womb and you're sort of absorbing whatever is being presented to you. And it's this dark space. And what do people want to do while watching a movie? They want to drink their favorite drinks. They want to have their favorite food. They want to have their favorite snacks. And so there's a comforting dynamic with that. You want to watch it generally with people that you love. You know, you want to watch it with friends and family and things like that. So that's a very Cancerian sort of thing too. And you want to watch a movie because you want to be inspired. You want to be terrified. You want to feel something,
Right.
in other words. And so that's a very Cancerian thing too. And speaking of movies, we have our friend Kris here to talk about cinema and Cancer symbolism.
Hey, Mario and Michelle. So on the topic of Cancer symbolism, when I look at the Cancer glyph, I always think of yin and yang, of course, and this motion the glyph seems to have. But I also think of the classic theater mask. One's happy, one's sad. We can relate the happy one to the summer solstice and the sad one to the winter solstice, which makes me think of how people are always anticipating summer after a harsh winter and a wet spring, waiting for summer to come along so we can get the blood flowing, get some sun, you know, get our toes in the grass, plant some things, get in the dirt, get into the water, you know, go soak in a spring or something like that. Do our hero's journey, go on our questing, as I would say. And you can also relate the classic story structure of the plot pyramid to this as well. The climax being the summer solstice. A classic depiction of this in film would be the classic westerns and spaghetti westerns. You know, the good outlaw who's wandered through into the town and now wants to save the town from this bandit. Tells him to meet him at high noon. The sun's at its highest point, its climax. The protagonist on one side of the sun, the antagonist on the other. You can also relate the hero's journey to this, and it makes me think of what Robert Bly talks about in the book Iron John, a book about man, where, if you don't know, this book is written as a companion almost to the book Woman Who Runs with Wolves, which is all about the wild woman. Iron John is all about the wild man and these rites of passage rituals. And in it, he talks about the two paths of rites of passage, becoming a full man, or in this case you could say a hero of sorts. One is ascending. That is the saintly hero. That's your saint. That's your monks. You know, you go into your hermitude. You're rigorous with your practices and all that. Some people do that. Most people in their day-to-day lives will often take the other path, and that is a descending path. What Robert Bly refers to as the path of ashes, or walking through the doorway of the wound. Really, this is embracing your breakdown, embracing your destruction so you can be rebirthed anew, this kind of phoenix kind of mentality. And we can see this in story structures and storytelling in film. You can also relate this to the summer solstice and the winter solstice as well. Of course, the saintly ascending path would be the summer, and the descending phoenix path, the descending then ascending path, the path of ashes would be the winter solstice. Examples of this, of course, would be Anakin / Darth Vader in Star Wars. That would be the descending path, the doorway of ashes going through the wound. the ascending path, the saintly path, would be Luke. One other example would be Zuko in Avatar The Last Airbender would be the doorway of ashes, the descending path, and Aang would be the ascending saintly hero path. And they both can work in different ways, right? Just like summer and winter have its purposes. It also reminds me of that quote from The Dark Knight that Harvey Dent says before he becomes Two-Face, the classic, you either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become a villain. I think what that means is if a hero lives long enough, he will essentially see his autumn. If you're going to continue using The Dark Knight as an allegory to this, the whole purpose that the Joker is trying to tell Batman and show him with Harvey Dent is that Harvey Dent hasn't embraced his shadow. Harvey Dent is this saintly hero of sunshine for Gotham. But what would happen when he meets his fall, meets his autumn, when he has to embrace his opposite, the winter solstice? And when he gives him that opportunity, he becomes Two-Face. He doesn't pass through the doorway of ashes. He doesn't go through the wound fully. He can't fully integrate both halves of himself. Going back to the happy and sad theater mask, you also see heroes when they reach their breaking points. They're crying and laughing at the same time. Just like someone who's super ecstatic, is maybe channeling God even, may be laughing and crying at the same time. It's this point where they're both the same. And, embracing this divinity or embracing this destruction to be rebirthed anew. You're laughing, you're crying. There's a thin line between love and hate sort of thing, right? And so to me, all of this is very Cancerian. My channel KOK, gets its name from King of Kups, the tarot card. And of course, the tarot card is depicted as a king, an emperor in his throne, sitting on his throne with 1 foot on water and 1 foot solid on stone on earth. So there was this balance there of solid and this fluid motion, the firmness and this changing of the tides. And so that's what I think of when I think of Cancer. And a lot of times when you think of Cancer, you think of this emotional, fluid, oftentimes maybe more effeminate even. But there's also this duality as in all of the glyphs of this masculine side. And to me, that's the King of Cups. So that's what I think of when I think of Cancer, is this kind of duality, kind of Taoistic kind of thing that also can be seen in the motion of storytelling in film and in mythology, which is really my entire outlet on my channel KOK. Well, anyways, thanks for having me and listening to my message. I am Kris, or King, from channel KOK.
All right, Kris, thanks for sharing your insights on Cancer symbolism, especially how it relates to cinema and the theater masks. I think that's a great analogy, actually. And I think it's appropriate for a lot of different reasons. As you're saying, this ascending and descending nature, and how these two energies are almost like rotating around a central point of pivot, right? Just like the yin yang glyph. And there's an equivalent of this in Freemasonry known as the two St. Johns. And one St. John corresponds with the summer solstice. The other St. John corresponds with the winter solstice. And they both have this laughing and crying dynamic as well. It's my understanding, and I could be wrong, but I believe the laughing dynamic has to do with the winter solstice, because there's a reason to celebrate, because the sun is coming back, it's starting to return, and then it's the opposite in the summer solstice, because now the sun is starting to wane. And so just something to consider or chew on. Another equivalent of this ascending and descending path would be the sage and the psychopath as well. And this is something that I picked up from Michael Tessarian. And it's really interesting how the sage and psychopath actually, in many ways, need each other. The same way the hero needs a villain, or else he wouldn't be the hero, right? And the villain needs their adversary, which would be the hero. And so there are definitely two parts of the same coin. In many ways, too, symbolically, you could say God and the devil are sort of the equivalents here as well, and that they're two sides of the same coin, and that they symbolically need each other as well.
Thank you so much, Kris. It was great to hear from you, as always. As you bring up the two St. Johns, I have to go into my herbal realm again and bring up St. John's wort, which is a plant of the summer solstice, blooming and blossoming right now, but typically there's a lot of lore and folklore around St. John's wort, and it is to be harvested on the summer solstice for the most potent medicine. And there's a lot of associations with the red color of the medicine that comes from St. John's wort and the blood of St. John when he was beheaded. So there's a whole line of great folklore that I recommend people look into if they want. The other connection here that we have with another plant that was just talked about is mugwort. In folklore, it is said that St. John wore a girdle of mugwort on his chest during his travels as a way to protect himself, because mugwort is known as a protective herb. So I just wanted to kind of bring that into the fold here when we're talking about St. John and all these connections. It's really interesting.
Well, it is interesting as well that Kris brought up the wild man.
Yes.
And St. John was basically known for being a wild man.
Right.
And so when he's depicted, he's wearing fur, and he's known for living out and about. And so a lot of times these characters that are associated with being a wild man or a wild woman, what they're saying is that they're from a different era, not the modern world. And so they've preserved information that belongs to an older time. And so St. John, he preserved information regarding the baptism. And so he passed that down to Christ. And so that's the reason why Christ and baptismal symbolism go hand in hand in Christianity. It's because St. John actually preserved that wisdom of the baptism. And so being a wild man, being outside of the city, outside of the village, they have a different way. And so they're more connected to nature. They're more connected to primordial ways of doing things. So that's oftentimes what they're encoding with a lot of this stuff. And once again, regarding this ascending and descending nature, it's perfectly encoded in the glyph of Cancer. And so it looks like it's spinning. It looks like it's turning. Notice that it's spinning counterclockwise. And to me, that's really, really significant, because the counterclockwise rotation actually brings you more inward. There's more of a polar association with that. The clockwise rotation, on the other hand, is more solar, and it's more expansive. So I brought up the Wheel of Heaven earlier. The Wheel of Heaven, from the perspective of Earth, it's spinning counterclockwise. And so the stars, from our perspective, they're going around the pole star counterclockwise. It's the same rotation that you see in the glyph of Cancer. So that's why I think that it really is truly embodying this idea of a cosmic wheel or something along these lines. Also, just have to say that this is related to the chariot wheel. And so when you're talking about the chariot wheel, you are talking about the Wheel of Heaven. And while doing research for this episode, it was really interesting to me the fact that we get the word carousel from chariot symbolism, and carousel actually means a round of chariots. And I guess some of the first carousels were basically little chariots, right? And it's kind of interesting to me that I'm starting to see a lot of like entertainment symbolism associated with Cancer that I don't know if I necessarily paid attention to before.
Yes, and to your point with that, I do have a quote from Barbara Walker, actually, her book, Secrets of the Tarot, where she goes on about this. She says, "Sometimes, instead of promenading through public streets for the admiration of the masses, a chariot procession was organized as private entertainment for the inhabitants of a castle. Decorated chariots moved around a central courtyard to be viewed from inner windows. This was known as a carousel, quote, a round of chariots." She also talks about in this same chapter about how it's funny that something like the chariot that was a practical vehicle that was used for, whatever it was used for, became the source of entertainment. And then it even was, I guess you could say, demoted to like a merry-go-round. So it's demoted to like just a child's toy. And Barbara Walker is actually really good about seeing things like that, things that have been taken more seriously at one point, but then were brought down to like a toy or just something that was used for entertainment.
This is the perfect parallel for a lot of modern games, actually. And let's just take Las Vegas as an example. You go to Las Vegas, you're going to see a lot of things related to poker and poker cards and dice and whatnot. A lot of those games started off as divination systems.
Right.
So dice were used for divination purposes, quote unquote, spiritual purposes for a very long time. I'd argue that tarot began as more of a divination system and then got reduced down to playing cards. Mm-hmm. There's people who have the exact opposite opinion. I don't think that that's necessarily the case. And so a lot of things in the modern world have been reduced down and have basically been completely neutered of their spiritual, symbolic, sacred quality. And so I'm pretty convinced of that. So your merry-go-round example, I think, is just one of these sorts of things there. Well, perhaps one last thought here regarding entertainment, cinema, and all these things as it relates to Cancer. And Kris brought up the theater masks, right? And so to wear a mask, to me, there's a very mercurial dynamic there. And so to wear different masks throughout your day, to wear different hats, if you will, that's very mercurial. And so Mercury, as I kind of alluded to earlier, has a major relationship with the moon, and I think arguably with Cancer as well. In fact, Barbara Walker, who we bring up just about every episode, her work is fantastic. She also has a tarot deck. And she puts a Mercury glyph right on the chariot body itself. Mm-hmm. So literally, she's associating all things with the charioteer and the chariot and that card with Mercury. And it's actually a very astute, kind of brilliant association, in my opinion. And so if you're an actor, if you're a performer, you're going to be mercurial. Because as an actor, you're going to want to have to embody a more masculine presence for one role, a more feminine presence in another role, a more secretive or elusive sort of presence for another role, right? And so this is what being an actor, I think, is all about. And I think being an entertainer too, you're transforming yourself. And so you wake up in your PJs, maybe you're one person. By 9 p.m., you're wearing something completely different. You're performing in front of a ton of people. And so this mercurial dynamic with entertaining and sort of allowing people to sort of sink into a vision of sorts or sink into some sort of like illusion or what have you, I think totally makes sense for the sign. In a way, this kind of relates back to the symbolism of the crab, in that in order to put on a performance, you have to put on a different exterior, and that's going to be more believable. That's going to be more entertaining, and the symbolic value is probably going to be higher as well.
Mm-hmm.
When I look to the Cancer ruled chariot, I see duality we were introduced to in Key 6, the Gemini ruled lovers, and harmonious motion. Venus gives us a helping hand here, ushering us into that first decan of Cancer season. In the Two of Cups, Venus influences this Cancer energy through love and healing. As one energy gently steps forward to lead, the other maintains a more receptive and still posture. And yet, this push-pull remains well-balanced, influencing true revelation and the way the caduceus at the top of the card shows two serpent energies winding around a fixed rod upwards towards the wings of enlightenment. In the Chariot, Venus positions her energy as a type of luminary that accompanies the moon's influence to light the way, and we see that on the crown of the charioteer, represented by the 8-pointed star. Venus is sometimes referred to as a morning star, the same way both Lucifer, whose name translates to light bringer, and Jesus were referred to as morning stars in Isaiah and Revelations, respectively. The sphinxes that drive the chariot show this combined representation of separate expressions of energies working together as one. Lucifer would relate more to that raw, instinctual, devourer energy of the lion as described in 1 Peter 5:8, whereas Jesus would be the more royal, majestic representation of that energy as the Lion of Judah detailed in Revelations 5:5. This 8-pointed star also reminds me of the ancient Mesopotamian goddess Ishtar, the goddess of love, war, and fertility, who shares these themes of death and rebirth similar to the way we honor Jesus Christ's death and resurrection on Easter. In the Kemetic Tarot deck, the chariot is represented by the Atet, a solar bark or vessel led by Amun-Ra, the sun deity. On the card, we see Ma'at leading the voyage with balanced scales and a lotus scepter representing enlightenment through authenticity and truth, followed by Tahuti, the ancient scribe, who holds an Ankh representing life force and a scroll. At sunset, the Atet enters the underworld from the west in the form of a great serpent to defeat Apep, the great serpent of chaos, burning him with holy fire and binding him to his domain. Once the battle is won, the Atet leaves the underworld where the sun rises in the east, and the same battle is fought for thousands and thousands of years until the end of eternity. You see, the Atet reminds us of victory through maintaining harmonious balance in the universe. The totality of the war is best won through the smaller victories of the battle, not allowing the negative to overpower the positive and vice versa. So when I think to the nature of Cancer, a deeply emotional and empathic sign, I'm reminded of the moon's influence here. The moon's proximity to the earth has been shown to influence human behavior where emotions drive the temperament and the decisions made from it. The goal here is not to villainize ourselves for our innate human desire and instinct. After all, we are spiritual beings having a human experience. Instead, Cancer season presents us with this opportunity to nurture our human nature through the spirit that governs us. The chariot puts us in the driver's seat of our own reality, while under the protective support of the cosmos. The armor of the charioteer, like the shell of the crab, asks us to maintain strong boundaries, to allow the seeker to observe what exists outside of it without absorbing it as their own. Cancer season also asks us to embrace this human and spiritual aspects of self. Those energies aren't always balanced. Sometimes life experiences asks us to lead into one more than the other. And still, the chariot teaches us assured victory when we allow both expressions to exist fully on its own with a love that unites us all. Thank you so much for listening. My name is Sierra. You can find more of my tarot archives as well as my socials at tarotalchemy.com. That's tarotalchemy.com. Hope this helps.
All right, Sierra, thank you so much for the voicemail. Much appreciated. Some interesting things here for sure. You know, one of the things actually that kind of stuck out to me is when you mentioned the solar bark, which is the solar barge or boat, essentially. And it's very much likened to the sun moving across the sky, that this was the idea. For a long time, basically the luminaries have been associated with boats or chariots for a very, very long time. And so a lot of times people have referred to the moon as a chariot, the sun as a chariot, Mars as a chariot, etc. But they've also been likened to boats as well. So that's what she was referring to, the solar bark. So it'd be like the sun as a boat moving across the sky, right? And this is interesting because bark sounds very similar, or has at least embedded within it ark as well. And so when we're dealing with the ark, we're dealing with a lot of container symbolism and vessel symbolism, just like Noah's Ark. What was the important thing with Noah's Ark? That he housed two of every animal, that he preserved humanity essentially in one boat, in one ark, while the whole entire world flooded. And so ark symbolism has a lot to do with chariot symbolism as well. And it has a lot to do with the symbolism of what we keep on going on about here with containment, right? With this vessel sort of concept. And so I just wanted to say that the boat and the chariot symbolically have a ton of overlap with each other. And so it makes sense then that the chariot card has this relationship with the moon, Cancer, water, all of these different types of things. And I would say by extension, really, all vehicle symbolism is pretty much related to this as well. So you can use the horse as an example. You can use the locomotive as an example. The Thoth deck has a well-known chariot card, and the four posts around the charioteer actually kind of look like smokestacks that you would see on a locomotive.
Right.
And when you consider when this deck was created, it makes a lot of sense. If I'm not mistaken, it was the late 30s, early 40s. And so all vehicles kind of retain this symbolism, and this relates to the idea as well that your light body also relates to this, and that it has sometimes been referred to as your Merkaba. And Merkaba in Hebrew actually means chariot. And so it's this idea that you take your light body, your aura or energetic body, and this is what you use to travel to other domains, astral travel, astral projection, and whatnot. So there's a whole field of study you can get into with all of this called Merkava mysticism, essentially, which translates to chariot mysticism, basically. But you could also, by extension, refer to it as your bark, your ark, your boat.
Thank you, Sierra. It's so nice to have you back here on the show. I really appreciate that you bring up the Venusian correspondence to Cancer, because one of the things about both lemon balm and mugwort, two plants that I've talked about a couple times today, is that not only do they have a correspondence to the moon, but they also have a correspondence to Venus. So depending on what source you're researching, you might see that lemon balm is solely connected to the moon. You also might see that there's a Venusian correspondence. And I do find that both the moon and Venus have very similar properties. And we have talked to someone before, Ola Wolny, that has a really interesting take on Venus actually being more prominent than the moon, and that the moon is actually a more modern take on what people were worshiping, what was actually ruling our cycles and things like this. So there is definitely some sort of thread here with the moon and Venus.
Yeah, well, this kind of reminds me a little bit that Venus oftentimes is associated with Lucifer. This is a whole entire weave people can get into. This is more of a Masonic thing, if I'm not mistaken. Lucifer is known as being the light bringer, and there's actually a really interesting relationship with light and Cancer that we haven't talked about today. And at least in Royal Arch Freemasonry, they will use the Cancer glyph and put it on top of the keystone in their Royal Arch. In some Freemasonic tracing boards, that keystone is removed, and there is actually light shining through that hole. And above that hole, there is an eye, like the eye of providence. And so basically it's the eye of God. And the idea is that light is shining through that hole, and this is where light emanates from. Symbolically, it relates like to source, I would say. And what's interesting about this is it perfectly parallels what I brought up earlier with Cancer being the gateway of man, the gateway into this domain, and Capricorn being the gateway of the gods, and how you exit this domain. So what Royal Arch Masonry is all about is emphasizing this light dynamic coming through Cancer. And this is fascinating because a Hermetic alternative title for the Chariot card is Lord of the Triumph of Light. And here we are dealing with the summer solstice where we have the most light available to us. So I know that's a big tangent, but there is definitely some sort of aspect here related to light symbolism that we haven't really touched on yet.
Yes, I'm so glad you went there with this one. And you just released a great video on this whole subject.
Right.
So that's another thing to look into if you want to hear more about this. But I do have another quote here that kind of just like encapsulates the Cancer Capricorn connection. This is from Zodiac Consults of Salvation yet again. They write, in ancient lore, Cancer is termed the house of physical conception, while Capricorn, the opposite sign, is concerned with spiritual conception. So that does make more sense of the gate of man with Cancer, the gate of the gods with Capricorn, as there's this spiritual dynamic with the Capricorn gate, and that's the end of life. So you're almost like, you're finishing out the cycle. So there is more of like a spiritual cycle that's concluding here, or beginning, and however you want to look at it.
Well, endings are beginnings, beginnings are endings.
Right.
But I hear exactly what you're saying, because with Cancer, if this is related to mother, the womb, being born, it's your physical incarnation.
Right.
Right. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
We are in a Cancer season, and it's time to talk about Cancerian astrology. As the cardinal water sign is related to the goddess of the sea, Cancer is a very nurturing feminine sign, traditionally connected to the home and comfort. It thrives on feeling secure. With all three water signs like merging and forming deep emotional bonds, this one has a hard shell like a crab as a protection due to the great sensitivity and vulnerability. The moon is the ruler of the sign, and Lady Luna strongly colors this sign of crab. The moon is the symbol of the silver queen in alchemy, while the sun is the golden king. So sun in Cancer has an inherent quality of alchemical union, bringing together the king and the queen, gold and silver. This psychic marriage offers the potential for profound integration and gives everyone with this sign inherent gender balance. Since it's ruled by the moon with its three phases of new, full, and old, this sign also associated with the triple goddesses, maidens, mothers, and crone. Selene is the goddess of the moon for the Greeks. Cancer's relationship with stomach and breasts places an accent on food and nurturing. Those the asteroid Juno and dwarf planet Ceres have resonance with Cancer because they're also nurturing goddesses with feeding and nursing their children. Artemis is the maiden goddess, is often portrayed with a crescent moon, as is Mother Mary. Artemis is known for her care of children and is also related to many divinities of the ocean and other bodies. Oceanus and Thetis, Titan divinities of the waters, had numerous offsprings, and many of them were Artemis's followers. Aphrodite, goddess of love, is portrayed born from the sea. Venus is also comfortable in the sign of Cancer. As the cardinal or prime water sign, Cancer is the great mother of the ocean, which is the resonant with the embryonic waters of the uterus, as it is all life born in the fertile sea. Casting reflected light on sign Cancer, Selene, goddess of the moon, and her lover Endymion, the setting sun, also had many children like the fertile ocean. Their 50 daughters are named Menae and appears to correspond with the 50 months or moons of the Olympiad, a time period related to the Olympic Games. So the sun and moon are both historically connected to the keeping of time. Cancer carries connotation of this flowing element, including waters of the womb and the lunar white milk from the breast. So indeed, our Milky Way galaxy was imagined by the ancient Greeks and the Romans as milk spraying from the breast of the goddess Juno or Hera. Galaxy comes from the Greek word gala, which means milk. So now think about Met Gala, mother's milk. The glyph for the sign of Cancer is shaped like 69 and has been compared to the spiral shape of our Milky Galaxy or vortex itself, which is Cancer is the cardinal sign of nourishment, ruling the breast as dispensers of milk and the stomach as digestion.
All right, Alina, thank you so much for that voicemail. That was great. Lots of interesting tidbits here. You mentioned the Silver Queen and Golden King. I love that you brought that up, in part because there are older alchemical illustrations where you see a man that has the head of a sun, and then you have a woman that has the head of the moon, a crescent moon. This is symbolically representing an alchemical marriage or royal wedding between king and queen, and therefore it makes sense that they would be associated with the sun and then also the moon. And what's really interesting, actually, is that their union sometimes happens in a ritual bath, and that they come together in this ritual bath, which reminds me of a lot of the container symbolism that we're talking about today. Speaking of which, the ocean itself, right? Just a body of water. So they're coming together in unification, and symbolically, this is related to the unification of opposites, right? And so I like the fact that you brought that up. Everything you had to say regarding the goddess and the fertile ocean, obviously that's all in play. Very interesting. You brought up Mother Mary briefly, and I think that that's intriguing as well, because oftentimes you will see Mary depicted with a crescent moon at her feet. This is also depicted in the High Priestess card, where she basically is kind of emblematic of the Virgin Mary, and you will see that crescent moon at her feet. So there's a very clear relationship there with her essence and the moon. You also brought up the maiden, mother, and crone being related to the three main lunar cycles. And obviously this relates to the triple moon goddess Hecate. And I think it's interesting that she has a relationship with dogs, of all things. And in the moon card, you will often see wolves or dogs howling at the moon. We've talked about this before, actually, if I'm not mistaken, during Taurus season, because we talk about Venus during Taurus season, and there's a whole relationship, as you brought up, with Venus and the moon, of all things. And one of our guests brought up the idea that the wolves, are they howling at the moon in reverence of the moon, or are they warning us against the moon?
Right.
It's kind of an interesting thing to consider when you think about it. But I bring this up because canine dog symbolism relates to the moon. That's why you see it in the moon card. And I maybe have discussed this before in previous episodes, but I was witness to a Hecate ritual, and in the middle of the ritual, a dog started howling. I thought that was perfectly timed, and I thought it was kind of eerie, actually, because of the symbolism of the triple moon goddess with dog symbolism. I just have to say, it's just on my mind now. Dogs have a lot to do with the underworld, and so they bury bones, as an example. Dogs are known for being guardians of gates, and so this is why they're on the moon card. You'll notice on the moon card, there's always two towers. So there's a symbolic gate, there's a symbolic opening, and those dogs are there, or the wolves are there, and it's because they protect that threshold, right? And so there's this quality to dog symbolism where they are basically guards. They're guards, and they're protecting sort of this opening of sorts. And so one way of looking at that would be that they are the guards to this underworld, to this other domain. And so I bring this up because when you look just into crab symbolism, not necessarily relating to the sign Cancer, just crabs, there's a lot of underworld symbolism with them. And when you look at them, they kind of look like underworld creatures.
They do.
Look at crabs for a little while. Look at lobsters. Look at them underwater, specifically in their natural habitat. They are very, very strange creatures. They are kind of off-putting. And so they're at the bottom of the ocean, scuttling across the ocean floors, right? Going backwards, going sideways, retreating. They kind of have this bug extraterrestrial sort of quality to them. So I can see why they would be related to the underworld.
I'd like to kick this off by thanking Mario and Michelle for letting me talk about the sign of Cancer, although I must say I am a little bit surprised. I'm not known particularly for being overly nice to the sign. I've probably, if anything, been a little bit too critical of Cancer so far in talking about it on the internet. Although on the internet, the side of Cancer that you tend to see is more young men with Cancer energy, pissed off young men with Cancer energy who care very much about things like heritage and homeland and nation. You don't necessarily online see the emotional, maternal, sensitive, domestic, caring side of Cancer so much. Not that those things are really what Cancer is. I would say that they're the manifestations of it more than they are the actual essence of the sign. It's a deeply misunderstood sign. People try and make Cancer about those things, but the actual essence of the sign itself is containment. The occult mystery hidden in the sign of Cancer is the idea of containment, because Cancer governs all of the vessels, all of the containers that hold and protect life until that life is capable of existing on its own. That's why Cancer governs the womb, so to speak, the cosmic womb in a sense, not just the mundane biological womb. It's the shell of anything that has a soul, so to speak. It's a point in the zodiac that the zodiac turns on. Ancient astrologers seem to have given Cancer more weight and more gravity than other signs. Particularly the axis that runs between Cancer and Capricorn, which seems to form one of the kind of main cosmic axes, Cancer being the gates of man, Capricorn being the gate to the gods. If you look at Platonic or later kind of Neoplatonic cosmology, the stuff that you can find preserved within the writings of people like Macrobius, you'll find this idea that the soul incarnates through Cancer. And when it's finished on Earth learning the kind of lessons that it's here to learn, that it shoots upwards and ascends, if you like, through Capricorn after completing its journey. Now, whether we understand this to be literal or purely symbolic, I don't actually think it matters. I think the message contained within it is rather extraordinary, because it means that Cancer is the point where spirit kind of has to accept limitation and incarnate on Earth into a box, into a container, into a vessel. Infinity enters the womb. The soul kind of puts on flesh. And this is why Cancer begins summer. This is why Cancer begins the height of the year. This is the season in its fullness. This is fertility. This is fecundity. This is manifestation, in a sense. Probably why Cancerian people make such good witches and wizards. It's not the only symbology to consider for Cancer, but it kind of runs through everything. It certainly runs through the crab, which I don't think by any means is an arbitrary decision. The crab kind of represents a universal biological law that life can only survive life can only persist if it's enclosed, if it's encased, if it's protected. The greatest biological adaptation of the crab is not the giant pincers or claws, it's the shell, it's the armor. And every Cancerian symbol kind of follows the same pattern. It's a womb, it's an egg, it's a rib cage underneath the kind of breasts, which themselves are hollow and contain things like a home is, like a temple is. In a weird way, like a nation or a family. It's a enclosed structure. All of these symbols seem to protect something, whether or not that thing is actually visible. And in there is a paradox. In there is the kind of ultimate Cancerian crab paradox of like hard outside, soft inside. There's a lesson in Cancer that perhaps actually being vulnerable isn't necessarily a weakness. The crab, the turtle, which is another similar but not quite the same symbol. I mean, a turtle is interesting because it carries a world, a microcosm, an ecosystem on its back. It's a creature, sure, but it's a sanctuary for other creatures. It travels, but it travels slowly and it travels short distances. It doesn't move far from its foundations. It's a really, really interesting creature to carry that sign and to carry that symbolism. And of course, the lobster, which is sort of replete in Cancerian symbolism as far back as the beginning of time. The lobster is interesting because it has to escape its shell in order to grow. There's perhaps another lesson hidden in the lobster that we might have lost a little bit by replacing it with a crab. The crab, though, is fascinating. The crab has these modern biological parallels to it, which are, if at least, extremely synchronous. If you look at evolutionary biology, and if you note a phenomena known as carcinization, which is completely underexplored, really, but fascinating regardless. It's the idea that completely unrelated strands of biological life that have deviated from each other millions and millions of years ago will, under certain biological constraints and conditions, default back to crab-like forms of existence. It's an idea that's been explored in sci-fi novels, actually, to a great extent. The idea, if we were to encounter aliens on another world, that they would perhaps look the high probability is that these things would look crab-like if they were to come from a similar environment to us. Scientists don't believe, and whether you believe in outer space or whether you believe in evolution, it doesn't necessarily matter here, but scientists don't necessarily believe that evolution has a predetermined goal. It's sort of just going out there randomly. And it seems that carcinization is one of these recurring evolutionary solutions where evolution sort of meets a dead end, becomes crab, and doesn't need to evolve anymore. It's one of the sort of final forms or ends of the evolutionary tree, so to speak. The idea that everything becomes a crab is symbolically astonishing if you think about it. Now, whether or not the ancients would have been aware of this or not doesn't necessarily matter, because they certainly would be aware that the crab is not nature's strongest animal or nature's fastest animal. It's just one of nature's most successful vessels and delivery mechanisms for life. The crab does not survive by dominating its environment. It survives through enclosing itself and just persisting over time. There are some people, some extremely schizo people in fringe, chattering corners of the internet who say that the moon itself is hollow. And whether or not that is the case, unlike the sun, just by looking at the moon and lunar symbolism, I think we can come to understand a lot about Cancer. The moon doesn't create anything. It just receives things and reflects things and takes from the sun and then gestates and regulates. And the moon is said to govern the tides and female menstrual cycles and therefore fertility, but also memory and ancestry and the common man, in the way that the sun might be said to govern the elites. The moon could be said to govern the mob and the common man and the unconscious tides of the emotions of people. If you connect that to Cancer, if you connect that to how these are some of the most intuitive, emotional, I don't really want to give them their flowers, okay? It's not a sign I like very much, but these are some extremely tapped in people, capable of kind of really understanding signs and symbols in the way that maybe a Gemini person can, but being able to emotionally communicate as well. If you look at the scarab beetle on the Dendera zodiac, which is our earliest depiction of Cancer before crab, before lobster, before tortoise or turtle, we have this ancient Egyptian Khepri, this being that it's supposed to represent, sure, the divine and the sacred and transcendence, but also like transformation. It rolls the rising sun across the sky, the scarab rolling this sphere. It's a symbol of emergence. It's a symbol of birth and incarnation. The Greeks emphasized the same thing in the sign. The last, and I think most interesting, although definitely most esoteric, has got to be the keystone symbolism and the stuff that Mario and symbolic studies have talked about recently, about how Cancer sits at the top of the arch, the top of the vault, the top of the keystone, and kind of holds it all together. If you remove the Cancerian keystone, the entire vault, the entire dissect upper half of the zodiac just crumbles. It's the linchpin that encloses everything else and holds everything else together. Cancer is, in a weird way, a principle of cohesion in the wheel. It might be the glue that literally holds a family together, so to speak. In the way that a house is never really just a house, is it? If there's Cancerian energy involved, then it becomes a home. There's definitely a hidden formula behind the sign. There's definitely hidden symbols in the sign, but it's always about building a vessel, a shell, a womb, a tomb. And these animal totems, be it the turtle, be it the lobster, be it the crab, or the scarab beetle, even the keystone to a certain extent, they're all just expressions of the same principle. If you have something that's sacred, you have to protect it before you can kind of let it out in the world. But I just want to thank Mario and Michelle for letting me do this and for letting me yap for 10 minutes about the sign. Symbolically incredibly underrated, even if they annoy me as people. You can find me on YouTube at Jord.
Thank you, Jord, for today's final submission. Really interesting stuff as usual. We received the voicemail after we recorded our commentary for the show, but Jord's insights can certainly stand on their own. Brilliant stuff as always. This concludes Symbolic Studies episode 19, which we recorded on the 4th of July. Many thanks to everyone who contributed a voicemail this episode, whether you decided to submit something on your own or by request. We're truly grateful, and you guys make the show what it is. Kristine Backes can be found at Reclaim Your Natural Wisdom on Substack or at KristineBackes.com. That's Backes, Backes. Emily Ridout can be found at astroyoga.org or emilyridout.com. Katriena can be found at The Venus Diaries on Substack or at KatrienaEmmanuel.com. Kris can be found at King of Kups TV on YouTube, and that's Kups with a K. Jord can be found on YouTube and X under the handle Jord. Tom can be found on Instagram at tmackey1018 and on Quora, tom-mac-69. Sierra can be found at the Sacred Pages on Substack or at tarotalchemy.com, and that's alchemy, ALKHEMY. As always, you can explore the Symbolic Studies archive for early podcast access, exclusive lectures, symbolic research, and more. Visit symbolicstudies.com to sign up. Once again, in case you weren't aware, I am available for tarot readings and private lessons. You can schedule a session on the website if you would like to have a private one-on-one session with yours truly. Also, I've been a designer for well over half my life. If you're in need of creative assistance with your project, check out my portfolio and get in touch. Links to all my accounts can be found at symbolicstudies.com. And once again, if you finished this episode and want even more insights, we'll be releasing a companion episode where Michelle and I continue the conversation in after hours. And that's going to do it. We'll see you shortly with the show on the symbolism of dreams, which I'm really excited about, followed up by an episode on the symbolism of Leo. Until then.